Tariff threats are back, but this time for a very different reason. US President Donald Trump is warning that he'll slap levies on several European nations for sending only small numbers of troops to Greenland in the face of his threats to take over that Danish territory. But will this potential new round of tariffs and possible counter tariffs mean a lot for the markets? And where does it leave Canada, especially with CUSMA negotiations set to begin shortly? Let's break it all down with Lachlan Wolfers, leader of KPMG Law. Lachlan, thanks very much indeed. It's only threats at this stage, but what is your reaction? Observers saying, well, tariffs are being used for all kinds of purposes now as a weapon.
So, Andrew, great to be with you. I guess as a starting point, as a humble tax professional, the idea that the sovereignty of certain land would depend upon tax and trade policy is certainly something a little bit out of my league. But I guess if you break it down, a lot of the news headlines is talking about the threat from the US administration to impose tariffs on European countries in response to the question of ownership of Greenland. But I really wonder if it would garner quite the same reaction if instead the news headlines said something along the lines of the US threatens to increase the taxes on its own citizens, which is essentially what a tariff does. So study after study kind of shows that the imposition of tariffs, the economic imposition of tariffs, typically falls on consumers, in this case in the US. Typically somewhere in the vicinity of 70% of that sits with them. And so I just wonder if we'd get quite the same reaction if those were the headlines instead.
That's interesting. Yep, we've heard tariffs called a sales tax, a hidden sales tax.
I think that's right. And I think the other aspect to mention here is that tariffs are not actually paid by governments either. So again, if we break this down, let's say you are a Canadian company looking to export to the United States. What does this really mean for you? I think in this situation, those exporters are focused a lot more on questions such as what their customer relationships look like, whether they are able to sell at competitive prices, and whether their products are able to get to market and compete effectively. I think Canadian businesses, and indeed in this case, European businesses as well, probably look at this as another speed bump in the road along similar lines to what they've seen for much of 2025.
In what sense? Do you mean drastic tariff threats are issued by Mr. Trump and then he walks it back? Yeah,
so that's been very much the mode of operation that we've seen. So, for example, there were threats against Canada over the release in Ontario of the anti-tariff advertisement. They were walked back. Obviously, the advertisement was as well. There were threats against Venezuela for countries that sell to Venezuela that didn't come to fruition. And then, many of us remember the tariff announcements that were made during the first quarter of last year, the Liberation Day tariffs, which, again, a lot of that was substantially walked back quietly with various exclusions, reductions of rates, etc. So that's the pattern that many of us have seen.
You reckon that the Prime Minister, Mr. Carney, has been slow balling when it comes to striking a trade deal with the States. He's been pretty muted in his response. He announced counter tariffs, then called them off, and he threw Mr. Trump a concession. He dropped the digital services tax on the internet giants.
Yeah, so the way I would describe it is this. So the first thing is the Prime Minister Carney could have agreed or rushed to agree to a trade deal with the United States in the same way that the UK did and Europe did. Now look where that's gotten them. Those trade deals with the UK and with Europe are now very much in question in light of the actions, or certainly the threatened actions that have been taken over the last couple of days. I think the second point is you may be reaching a trade deal in respect of an issue or with someone who may not have the legal authority to do that. And obviously this is happening against the backdrop of the US Supreme Court decision on the imposition of IEEPA tariffs and whether that's lawful, that decision is imminent. Could happen anytime between tomorrow and June this year. And I think that will have a significant impact on this. But I think the other aspect, just to sort of step back from this, is the Canadian economy is actually proven to be remarkably resilient to these tariffs that have been imposed and certainly threatened along the way. Whilst growth has slowed in Canada, I think it is really important to recognise that somewhere between 70 and 75% of Canada's economy is services, not goods. Services are, of course, not subject to the imposition of tariffs. It certainly has an impact on Canada's export markets and its dependency on the United States. But the Prime Minister has very much sat back and said, this is a long-term transition we need to see in the Canadian economy away from the dependency on the United States and diversify across many countries. And that's why he's doing things like spending time, as we saw in China recently. We're seeing him in the Middle East as well, trying to strike new deals with other countries to diversify Canada's trade portfolio. And that's a long-term transition. And I think the final aspect to see in all of this is Canada has not been substantially impacted by the tariffs to date, primarily because of the CUSMA agreement that sits in place. Now, Canada's focus very much needs to be on this review of the CUSMA agreement coming up in the middle of this year.
We've only 30 seconds, but is it almost pointless negotiating any kind of deal with Mr. Trump in that he seems willing to walk away from any agreement?
So I'll borrow a line that I think my wife said to me very recently, which is that, tariffs were imposed on Canada because of a perceived fentanyl crisis. Well, tariffs have about as much to do with fentanyl as chopsticks have to do with an Italian restaurant. And we're seeing the same thing play out again with Greenland. There is no correlation between them. And therein lies the question around the futility of a trade deal, because it could be anything that causes or is the trigger for the threatened imposition of tariffs.